morning, Jan Recker.
Hey, Nick.
I guess it's afternoon for you. We have two of the most illustrious guests, the two most illustrious guests we've ever had on our show joining us today.
That is true, but it's also very simple because we only had 5 episodes, so being the most illustrious guest doesn't mean a lot.
And the other guest was Brad Greenwood, and that's not illustrious at all. So
that should
but
not
now,
be a benchmark.
These are the real deal. We have, in no particular order, Brian Pentland from the great United States, who's a organizational routine scholar. And we also have Will van der Aalst from, I guess, the Netherlands and Germany, we discussed this last time, the third most cited computer scientist ever. And I know Herb Simon's number one. I don't know who's number two, but so that's incredible. So welcome to our show, Brian and Will.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So just to give you a background as to why we invited you to the show, we were talking about these, and really the way Recker brought it up is we have organizational scholarship and they study routines and processes. We have computer science and they study routines and processes. And then somewhere kind of in the middle is this information systems discipline that also has some folks that study routines and processes. And we think that they're kind of coming together now. Brian, you're perhaps instrumental in this. So why don't you start talking to us a little bit about, all right, are they coming together and why? What's going on? Let's start with a little background.
Well, I sure hope so. I mean, I come from the organizational side, so I can remember in graduate school thinking, wow, this routine stuff's really interesting. I should study that. And then, I don't know, it must have been 10, 15 years ago, I said, holy smokes, there's this whole other research community over there that's doing the best work methodologically. And the organizational world doesn't know anything about it. And it's just like these two separate islands. And so,
well, it literally is separated by an ocean, right? One is in the U.S., the other's in Europe.
I guess that's true to some extent, yeah. But I mean, there's people that do both all over, but certainly the center of mass, I guess, for process mining has been in Europe. But to your question, I think that there's enormous opportunities, and I think people are just waking up to say, hey, wait a minute, there's the tools and the research questions could be, cross-fertilized.
Now, from your perspective, because you want to use process mining, but here's Will listening to all this, and Will, you're thinking, yeah, that's all fine, but they can maybe use our tools, but I can't actually learn anything from the organizational people. They're kind of in my way.
That's completely right. No. Well, I think in these discussions, we always think of the different disciplines as something that is stable. So today I had a long meeting about Pieshaped computer scientists. It was very interesting. Where after T-shape, you now have Pieshaped. T-shape means that you're very strong in one discipline and have a broad interest. Now they talk about pie-shaped, that you have two strong legs in two different disciplines. What I think people underestimate is that...
Why is that a pie shape? Oh, like pie, the symbol. I was thinking a pie that you eat. Okay, yeah.
So that is now the new word after T-shaped. And I think these words are often used to try to bring people together from different disciplines to create something new. What I think is what I see as important, we like to think about disciplines as things that are stable, but they are not stable. I was in the Netherlands. I did my studies from 84 to 88 in Eindhoven, and the computer science curriculum started there in 82. So I was in the second or third year was given. And the curriculum that I had has very little to do with the curriculum that people would study today.
Yeah.
So we like to think about things as being stable. So for sure, computer science changed a lot. I think one of the major changes that we are witnessing now is the transition from, let's say, being purely model-based or like creating models, creating systems, etc., to more data-driven. Like we are teaching here classes in data science and machine learning, and these are the classes that are taken by thousands of students. The real theoretical courses are taken by just a few.
Wow.
So this field is transitioning. And I also hope that in organizational sciences, there will be something similar, that with the availability of data, it will become more interesting to actually use the data and to do, let's say, real empirical work. And I feel that that is something that could bring the disciplines together.
So can I jump in here? Because, well, I know you for what, like 15, 16 years now. And I remember you were, back then I would have said you were really theoretical computer scientist, very strong on formal algorithms and proving them and so forth. And now you come out and say, look, it's a lot about data science. I want to play with data. And I always thought that was a turning point in how you saw, things like empirical research. I always felt that in the beginning, and I mean the early 2000s, that was not something you would concern yourself with. And now it sounds like you're saying, look, these things come together. I can't do computer science without data, and I can't do data without computer science. Is that what you're saying?
Well, if you look at my own development, and I think, you see that also in the development of the field, I have three phases in the way that I worked. I started off as a purely model-based person, right? I thought that if we make models and we prove properties over models, that models have certain properties, then if we do that, the world will be better, right? That was first. And that was beautiful to do, and I think it gives a strong basis. Then I had a phase where I was very much, let's say, systems oriented. I thought, okay, if we put these models in workflow management or BPM systems, and if these systems are good enough, think about the workflow patterns and YAWL, etc. Then the belief was, okay, if these systems are good enough, then everything will be okay, right? And of course, that was also an oversimplification, because the way that people work and that organizations function cannot be captured in a very simple model. And also, we easily neglect the fact that what is in SAP and how it survived, was that it can handle all of this complexity. And that led to the transition of being more data-driven. Of course, at the beginning of my career, I could not have done anything meaningful related to data because it was simply not there.
There was no data, yeah, absolutely.
So for me, I think in my case, you can clearly see that transition. I think you see that in other researchers, but what I think will be much more spectacular is, let's say, the people that are studying now. They cannot believe people that just make statements without being supported by some form of data or some form of evidence.
So is there an analogy, Brian? Is it similar to the organizational science of things? So I don't think they were necessarily transitioning, obviously, from model to system to data. I always thought there were the sort of very theoretical, philosophical guys, and then there were the empiricists. Isn't?
Yeah, but that's still true. There's certainly people that are interested in theory for its own sake, and but I think what's happened is the possibility. I think my own training was in ethnography, observational fieldwork and participant observation. So it's very empirical, but it's very local. You study what's happening here now, and so I think the thing that to me is really exciting is being able to capture processual phenomena across a much wider scope of time and space.
Well, in ethnography, you're dealing with real big data, right? So you were actually the first big data, because if you think of an ethnography, think of all this stimulus when you're doing an ethnography.
Oh, yeah,
right?
well,
that's everything. It literally is in front of you. Whereas if you're doing, say, process mining, you're just looking at timestamp traces of a very small subset of things, right? So it's much smaller data than an ethnography in one sense, right?
I suppose so. Yeah. Although, yeah, sure. That. But I think the thing about back to Jan's question, the disciplinary opportunity is to say, well, now what's happening, more broadly in an organization over time, what's happening in a larger field, and to do it with something that's not just, interviews, or surveys or something, but actually what's happening. I mean, that's the sort of mining and discovery part that it's just crucial.
But can I look, you both come out and say, look, it's a wonderful thing that these disciplines are converging. We have data and that speaks to both camps, and we're changing our views, etc. And everything becomes interdisciplinary, all being pie-shaped. And I think that's all, frankly, that's a bit of bullshit. And the reason is
some of us are pear-shaped.
Pear-shaped, yeah. Pear-shaped.
So, I don't know, pie-shaped.
No, hey, come on! I want to bring up the first controversy here. Don't distract me with your body. So
you're not pear-shaped. You have kind of broad shoulders. You're more square. On my screen.
So let me get back to this. So this entire interdisciplinarity stuff. This sounds wonderful in keynotes, and it's a wonderful thing to put in editorial statements and missions and all these sorts of things. And we do this in our training. And the reality is, it's not being done. And I'm not even sure it can be done. For example, one of the reasons is that we may do interdisciplinary research, maybe because the phenomena, this is saying, the phenomena do not live in the disciplinary silos that we invented to study them. Yeah, okay, fair enough. But we're still writing papers that go to one journal that is being read by one audience. So, and I know what I'm talking about because I was trying to do empirical research 20 years ago in process management and sent them to the same conferences that Will would go to. And I would get them back with a comment that we don't want to see this stuff here, So, and I don't think that has changed all that much. So while it's nice that it's all possible and the opportunities exist, I think the reality.
So let me give you, before we let Brian and Will speak, what I'm hearing is this. You try and do anything with process mining and say an organizational journal or whatever, you'll be booted out fairly quickly. No one's interested in this stuff. And they'll actually beat you up on all the stuff underneath because it's not something they're familiar with. And then you try and include any sort of organizational routines, ideas in, say, the BPM community. They'll be like, what are you doing here? You don't need this, help us solve a real world problem. Cut this BS about ostensive performance, right? So we claim they're coming together, but if your name isn't Brian Pentland, it's not coming together.
Yeah, like I earlier talked about pie shapes, and I think with all people of the two legs, one is thick and the other is thin.
Yeah,
that's very difficult to change. I think also if you look at the real, let's say, top researchers, they are often monodisciplinary. There are very few examples of, let's say, people that are really pie-shaped and are successful in that sense. And that has to do probably with publication, effects, funding, etc., etc. But on the other hand, that's why I said earlier, and I strongly believe that disciplines themselves are changing, and perhaps a new discipline will emerge, right? So if you look in the German setting, for example, Wirtschaftsinformatik is a recognizable job profile. My second son wants to study that. He's 16 years old. And he thinks this is something that I would like to study. You could argue that is interdisciplinary in some way. So fields emerge because there is a profile of something that people would like to study because they can see the jobs behind it. And then it can be in between two fields. If you think of something like bioinformatics, it would be very similar. Right? It's a profile that people study and they can imagine these are the types of jobs that we'll have, and then it will be like that automatically. Or people do it because they think that they can get wonderful grants to do particular things. And so I think that is driving people. I think it's not related to that foundational one is in one discipline, because the disciplines are changing all the time. And so there are still people that get emotional if a computer science education does not have a course on compilers, in my view, it's completely irrelevant, right? The same as my first lecture that I had to teach in Eindhoven was database systems 2, where I had to explain how a hard disk was being built with its seek time and rotation and latency, etc., etc. At that point in time, I already thought it was completely irrelevant, right? So disciplines are changing, and I think this happens much more than we like to think.
You think so? That it happens more than than it lets on. Wow.
But very slow, very slowly, Will.
But just compare curricula, just compare. So Jan mentioned earlier the BPM conference. I talked about the transition that I experienced. Look at the papers in the community. It made exactly that transition. Right?
It did, but you know, we gotta.
So now, if you would try to submit a paper on a new modeling technique or something like that, you will be killed 3 times, right?
That is true. But sorry, Brian, you wanted to say something before I bring it to a different dimension here.
I mean, as I heard your question, it was about publishing research, right? And you know, I mean, I have a couple of anecdotes. I remember we submitted a paper to the Journal of Organizational Research Methods that was based on a process mining kind of thing, and the reviewer said, you know, there's no data like this. You can't. I've never seen data like this. So obviously, this paper is worthless and should be rejected. And I was like,
wait, that can't be what they said. What do you mean? How could they say there's no data like
very
this?
closely? Like they're saying, I have never seen data that's like a time-stamped event log. And so consequently, your paper, which uses that kind of data, can't have any relevance for organizational research. That was their logic. It was like, well, since this is, you know, it was like, I don't know where you got that crazy data, but we're not publishing it in our journal.
So I've heard of people say, you know, Disco Pro-M, you know, don't use this because we don't understand it. I've heard reviewers say that to friends of mine that tried to.
Well, then that's the next,
right?
That's the next.
And then it's like, well, if you don't understand it, neither do I, but I want to use it because it has these cool patterns, right? But what were the other stories? Yeah.
But to Jan's point is that there's going to be a community of people who are not it's foreign. If they're not educated, they don't get it. And so if, you know, in order to make inroads and get both legs working, you know, you've got to have people who say, okay, yeah, I've heard of that. I know something about it. Or editors who can say, yeah, I'll find a reviewer who can help me with that, so that you get the different perspectives in. But I think that the real thing, and this now gets to Will's thing about the discipline changing, is, you know, realizing that there's a research problem that we have that can draw on a method that we have. I mean, so to me, the thing that I'm just, you know, feel like I'm just getting started on is, you know, routine dynamics as network dynamics, right? That idea that, okay, you know, patterns of action either change or don't change. You know, they can have a lot of inertia or some, but then can we bring network science, you know, and apply that? And it all boils down to ways of analyzing event logs, you know, and creating graph structures and, you know,
taking time into consideration, because that's the risk if you're turning it into a network, is that now you're going to eliminate time and turn it into just cross-sectional patterns comparison.
But anyway, but it's changes, but slowly, because you got to build up the competence and the reviewer base to be able to
That's actually two topics I wanted to bring up. So number one is, okay, it's changing slowly. What do we got to do if you want to see this elsewhere? I mean, we're talking about process sciences from the computer and the organization science, because that's, you know, where we know you guys and we have a little bit of understanding of that. But it would apply to other things as well, right? You could think about, I don't know, other cross-disciplinary stuff. But the key thing is, okay, why is it changing now? What do you think? I mean, I have some theory about why we see these movements, why we have Will and Brian here in the same window talking to one another, and why we start going to the same conference and so forth, why this is happening now. And you have, you know, why not now? Why not 10 years ago? I mean, the process mining is what, like 15 years old? And even the data, we have lots of it now, but we also had it 10 years ago. Now in the podcast, for example, Will, I mentioned your keynote at the European conference in Utrecht, and I looked it up, it was 2013. Yeah, so in Utrecht, you gave this conference on I call it the things you can do with process mining. And I was sitting there and I knew it already, but I was mind blown. And you basically just came out and said, look, this is event data, and I have lots of it because you had it from the entire Dutch country basically. And these are the things you can find out, right? And this is 10 years ago. And it still took another 10 years and we're still only getting started. So, right. Why is that?
Yeah, so like I could tell another anecdote, right? So Peter van der Brand was the first of my students starting a process mining company, Futura Process Intelligence. This is over 15 years ago. So I've been working on this since the late 90s. He worked on PROM before, then he started his own company. This was also built into the software of Pallas Athena. In 2009, I gave at the Gartner BPM conference, I gave a keynote on process mining, and that was the same year that the company of Peter van der Brand, Futura and Process Intelligence, won the Gartner Cool Vendor Award. So we had my keynote, wow. We had the Gartner Cool Vendor Award, and I thought, yes, we are there, right? There was also a report of Gartner after this, and it was like, it was exactly what Jan said. So it's amazing that this is possible. Let's stop whatever we are doing. We are just going to do this. And then I thought, okay, my job is done. But it didn't happen. So somehow, people change slowly. Sometimes I think people need to be forced to change. I think if you look at the facts, then you can see there was first the research, then there were the tools. First with like Fluxicon, Futura Process Intelligence, very close to my chair. Then also Celonis was founded in 2011. That was also not an immediate success. If you look at their first versions of the software, it was very, very primitive. What you've seen in recent years is that because of the success of companies like Celonis, people get greedy, right? And then you have like a snowball effect, that now suddenly there are over 35 process mining companies. Everybody is doing it, not in the US, but here in Europe.
Not in the US. This whole time you're talking, everything is happening in Europe. Why isn't there process mining in the US? What's happening there? How I don't understand this.
Why was there no BPM research in the US?
I don't know. What's the answer? Like BPMN at the University of Georgia, we taught them BPMN. We actually taught them some process mining stuff, and this is big data analytics. This should be part of every big data analytics curriculum, right? And no one knows about it. No one knows about it. There was a guy who came over, I forget his name, but he went to Deloitte, and he was a partner. Do you know this guy, Will? And
probably, yeah.
I think and he was trying to push process stuff in the US. And for a number of years, and it just didn't get traction.
Yeah. But I think these things will come. But I think these regional differences are not that unusual, I would say. So if I look at the entire history of the BPM conference, if I look at like you can also look at a field like Petrinet research, right? That was strong in Europe. Then for a short while, it was something that was done a lot in the US. Like I always like to talk about the first workflow management systems. They were developed in the US by people like Skip Ellis and Mike Zisman, and they were using Petrinets to do that. Anatole Holt, there were many people around that time. And then it kind of disappeared. And in Europe, it continued. And there are these regional differences. Like one of the things that I find fascinating, which is kind of opposite, which completely disappeared, is that there were the business workflows that were in Europe. and there were the scientific workflow people that were all in the US. They were not in Europe. And why was that the case? My hypothesis is that there were lots of grants kind of in that field in the US, creating that whole community that then disappeared afterwards. So it's a pity, but it's not unusual, I would say.
So here's my theory on what's happening now. I think what's happening now in this entire idea of disciplinary convergence really comes down to a couple of key individuals that have, a particular standing or reputation within their community, and they are the ones that step aside to the other ones. Brian, for example, you've started frequenting the BPM conference for a number of years now. So what's that like? For the last 3-4 years, you were invited to give a keynote at some stage, but you also submitted paper then, though. So you reached out, so to speak. Yeah. And Will, you actually, spoke out publicly, sort of what I meant earlier, embracing data, which not all computer science is like. Yeah. So someone saying, look, empirical data is important and so forth. So I think it boils down to some of the actions and some of the words by certain influential center figures in the disciplines. And if that's not happening, then it could be that the topics are aligned or the methods are aligned or, whatever else is a great opportunity. But if it doesn't come down to certain individuals at the core of their old disciplines, then nothing is happening. Don't you agree?
I think certain things are inevitable. You just do not know what the speed is at which they will happen.
I don't think so. I always think that it's much more social. It's not inevitable. I think it really always comes down to certain people that have a high standing in their respective science communities and that people look up to and that people follow and so forth. I see so many, younger scholars, and they so look up to everything that certain people say, do, tweet. And I always think that these people don't even know how important they are in forming the next generation of scholars.
Yeah, like I want to hear what Brian has to say because I look up to him, not you. And so, what do you have to say on this?
Well, that's all very weird. I mean, so Jan, what you're sort of espousing is the institutional entrepreneur, which makes sense.
Someone has to.
I don't know if it's sort of me or somebody else. I certainly have actively been trying to do this, for the reasons I said before. I just think there's a huge opportunity, but the roadblock. So for me personally, it's like when I flip open, one of Will's papers and I'm seeing lemmas and proofs, I'm thinking, okay, this is a high barrier to entry. Someone who's not trained that way, I can slog my way through if necessary enough to get the idea. But it's a lot of people would say, that's just a foreign language. I can't cope. Right. And so there's this big wall there. And that's true even of, leaving out the formal stuff, just with, a more complex quantitative model, it's a struggle. Right. And so that's where the sort of having people trained and more trained, that's a thing. Also, sequence stuff, frankly, it's a whole different beast. If you're talking about sequential and diachronic kind of phenomena, it's you can't just fire up Stata and do your simple regression or even your sort of normally kinemetric methods are not gonna fly, right? So there's an actual scientific question of how do you model dynamic networks. It's not a simple thing.
So not only that, Brian, but there's no dependent variable. That's obvious, right? And you've been wrestling with this ever since your sequential variety.
That's just me. That's just because I'm lame and I don't have a good, that's where the industry connections really help. Is like having, having a dependent variable like, quality, faster, better, cheaper, quality, time, cost, any of that
doesn't
stuff.
work with routines as well, right? It works with trivial routines, right? We want them to be more efficient. So we get that. But then if there are exceptions, you want to handle the exceptions. Then if there are other, right? So there's a lot of, if it's an innovation process, right? Of any sort that involves any type of creativity in it, right? You can't just say more efficient, right? So there's no dependent variable that's obvious when you look at processes.
Well, I can't imagine that that's true. I mean, that's certainly, because it is speed, quality, cycle time stuff. So here's one that I'm super
Yeah, but
excited
that's the
about.
operations. That's the
Yeah.
trivial stuff, right? You're coming up with these
Is
ideas
it?
like drift. Well,
I
you're
can't
coming
imagine.
up with ideas like drift, like sequential variety, right? There are these concepts around the patterns and the movements of those
Yeah.
patterns, right? That I think are the where it's at now. I think,
Well, let me give you an example of a thing that we're actually just now sort of hot on the trail of. So it may take a year or two to get this done. But so so this is an example of using process mining sort of and timestamped event logs, but not trying to discover models. Okay. So what we're doing is using our electronic health record data and looking at how synchronized the actions are, by which we mean like take 10-minute moving time window and see are people basically working at the same time or not. And the metaphor we like is like it's like an EKG for the clinic, and is the heart pumping, bump, 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 bump. And what we find is that the synchronization has a big influence on the visit time. So the time of visit, or length of stay if it was inpatient, is one of the like holy grail dependent variables in all of healthcare. It's hugely important because it governs, how many people you can see and what it's going to cost.
yeah.
Right. So, and this synchronization thing is a thing that people have not, that we're aware of, really looked at that much. And so far we're seeing that, it's not a huge effect, but it's, it's like, how about that? So we're playing around with things like that are, because I think your question is right on point, is like, you can spin up new concepts, but who cares unless there's some outcome, so
Yeah. And
we're
it's
working on
tough.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
And I want to go back to my original, because I had this idea where I think, Brian, you and I have talked about this in the past. Organization, it's hard. It's difficult for a number of reasons, but organizational IS people can use process mining in the sense that when we start to learn these tools, some of us can maybe start using them in our research, and we can maybe import them and get them accepted, right? The other way, Will, I don't think you need us for anything, do you? I mean, other than as consumers of your stuff, right? You just, you're like, all right, it's nice that they're using our stuff, but we don't really need any ideas or any of their contribution to our field, right?
Well, partly I think that is true. And I'm much more influenced by applications in industry, I would say, than other sciences. Right? And like if you are a core process miner, you are in this beautiful position where you talk to, I don't know, a car manufacturer, you talk to an airport, you talk to a hospital. They have processes, you analyze that process, and while doing that, you get lots of brilliant new ideas on how to do that. What is, of course, important if you look at an educational point of view, that I feel that it is very important to embed process mining in other curricula. And Brian, I just talked about the dilemmas and the theorems in my paper. I think my papers are extremely easy to read. But
for you,
yeah, I was going to say,
but that does not hold for all people.
You have a manifesto paper, I think, that's easy to read. I've read that one, right? That's like process mining for real dummies. So that's about my level.
But that's exactly the reason why, let's say, cooperation between disciplines is important, to also embed these types of things, let's say, in settings, to explain to people. Like another example would be, and I'm now referring a bit more to the Wirtschaftsinformatik scene. Most computer scientists find it completely uninteresting to study SAP and to learn about all the different table names and all the, they think it's like a complete waste of time. At the same time, I realized that it is very important that people that know about these things, that are teaching these courses, are somehow embedding process mining in these courses and combining it with the knowledge of these types of systems to do things that really have an impact in industry. Because if you just have a process mining tool and that's all you have, and then people have to do everything themselves, it's not going to work. So in process mining, there is this saying that I've said many times, is that if you do your first process mining project, you're spending 80% of the time on data preparation, understanding the data, asking the questions, and only 20% on analysis. So this 80-20 rule is showing that it is not enough to just have, let's say, people that build the software. You also need to have more.
Yeah.
So you answered this question. Well, Brian, you were going to say something, but you answered the question. You said it's partially correct, but then you went on to say, yeah, they need our stuff. Brian, go on. I'm sorry.
Well, in that 80% of understanding what's going on, I mean, that's where managers and organizational behavior people and like, why is it that no one uses this table the way it was designed? And, what's happening here that causes this unexpected friction, like those, so that it's in practice. So, Will, when you're talking about working with a hospital and an airport and a car manufacturer, I mean, those are opportunities, tremendous opportunities to learn stuff, right? Huge. And it makes perfect sense that, but I would guess that the stuff that you learn, a lot of it would fall under sort of the organizational managerial issues. Somewhere in that 80% is,
like for sure that's the case, but it often, like these applications also trigger new scientific problems. So I think, like, you talked often about sequences. I hate sequences. I think the whole world is partially ordered. While we are talking here, my secretary is doing things, and the order in which we do that is completely irrelevant. So I'm a partial order person. That's like my religion and my belief. And you can see that by doing applications, you find out that these things that you always talked about, that they actually are super important. A nice example is that we are now doing mining of the curriculum here. So all the students that study at our university, they flow through the curriculum, and many are inactive and disappear, right? I think many universities have had this problem. And you then see that is making a sequential model doesn't make any sense. You need to think about the partial orders, because otherwise you are focusing on the way that the order in which exams are being scheduled is determining the sequence. And that's complete nonsense, of course.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So
I have a question.
Go for it. No, go for it.
So with declarative mining, like I've been sort of trying to read up, because when we talk about partial ordering, I mean, the idea that there's going to be constraints in an overall process, but the order is otherwise flexible, right? That captures, at least to some extent, the idea of partial ordering, doesn't it? The declarative.
Well, partially, there is the traditional way in which you would program things, and I think that's not good. The traditional way in which you would program a procedure, you would say, okay, now I have done that, and then I have a choice: am I going to do that or that? And then I go through a loop, etc., etc. I think that is completely flawed if you start looking at processes. That doesn't work. So then you need to take the perspective that in principle things happen in a certain order, but that order may be less relevant, right? So if you look at, and many people do not understand that, but if you look at the notion of Petri nets, a Petri net without any places is also a Petri net. So a Petri net without any places is the Petri net where all the activities that are in the net can happen in any order at the same time, as many times as you want. So Petri nets are extremely declarative, extremely concurrent. And then you start, you take this worldview, anything can happen. And then with places, you can add constraints, right? And that's very similar to, let's say, the declare models that we use. That there you then use logic to express these constraints. That if I do that, then after that I need to do that. But it's very similar to adding places. So I think many people have an incorrect understanding of what is declarative if they consider something like Petri nets very procedural as a kind of opposite, which is not.
Guys, I want to bring it up a little bit back to the question about the disciplines per se. I thought it was really interesting that you came out and said, "Oh, I'm not really sure what I need IS for," and I was thinking about that too because I wanted to jump to the defense, and I got nothing. So Brian jumped in and said, "Oh, look, there's a role in the 80% for the organization to understand that, to know what the managers are doing, and so forth." And the IS side, I'm not sure what we bring to the table. I'm not really sure. We're a little bit the glue. I get that, but neither here nor there. So I guess the question that I have is, you talked a lot about the German Wirtschaftsinformatik, yeah, Will, and my observation is that where that started from was really close to the computer sciences, right? So it was sort of like applied computer science was an equivalent to IS in a way, right? But I think it moved away. And I think the entire field has moved very close to the organizational side and even further away from software engineering and computer science. And many schools, and in our field, very few papers are really close to the software engineering and the computer science side of things. And I always think that's a pity. Yeah, I always think that's a pity. But would you agree that we've seen this shift, that it became more and more of an entire business school topic where very few people know the fundamentals, let alone the difference between procedural and declarative modeling? I think we lost a lot of people in that discussion.
So I think if you look at historically, if you talk about information systems, and I know the Dutch setting, of course, from much longer, information systems in the Netherlands would always be embedded in computer science. If you look at information systems in the US, it is not. It is typically not. No. So you see a big divide there. So in Europe, information systems, Wirtschaftsinformatik, I completely agree that started basically from, let's say, applied computer science and then moved on. I think what had a bit of a killing effect is that for many young researchers that want to do a career, for them it is very important where they publish, right? And what I see is that the IS field has been highly influenced by, okay, there are a few top journals that you have to publish in, and that's very important. And the moment that there is a lemma, right, it would be rejected immediately or something like that. So I think that transition was probably influenced by the point that you made in the beginning of the effects of journals. On the other hand, I would say that in Germany, you could argue that there are many different flavors of Wirtschaftsinformatik.
There are, yeah.
Yeah, like I'm one of the editors of the BISA journal, and the BISA journal used to be called the Wirtschaftsinformatik, and I think it still has this transition of being in the middle. Right?
I think so. Yeah, it's very diverse in a very good way. That you have a highly diverse set of papers that come through that, from very technical, very formal, to very organizationally. Brian, you're sort of at the other half, right? You're sort of half a sociologist, but you're also in IS in a way, right? You like always thought of you that you're sitting neither here nor there. Is that
exactly? That's why I'm in Scotland today. No. Yeah. I'm very marginal. I'm not in any of those, communities really. I've always felt like, but I mean, I think Will's exactly right that in North America, in the U.S. universities, there are a few top tier journals, and that defines the club. If you're in those journals, you're in the club, and you get to say, I'm an IS person. And if you're not in those journals, then you're like, well, we're not sure what you are,
Yeah.
and I just have tremendous problems with that. That just doesn't, I mean, I get it. I understand why that's true, but it doesn't seem to it doesn't seem to encourage interdisciplinary thinking or,
Well, that's what I meant in the beginning.
collaboration across. Yeah.
That's what I meant in the beginning, that the reality is, like, I always think of interdisciplinarity. There's this beautiful little tweet that says, my best friends are interdisciplinary. And I think that's just a wonderful pun that sums it all up. It's a wonderful thing to aspire, blah, blah, blah. But the next morning, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to worry about that paper for that one journal that is highly regarded in my field.
And that's the issue, because what is a journal? Well, it's a conversation, and there are certain people who edit the journal. There are certain people who target the journal, and there are people who want to, and like any good conversation, you want to listen before you interject, right? So you need to read, you need to write to those people. And this is my assessment, Recker, of the situation we have here. I think Will is in a conversation, and he is so deeply in this conversation. As a matter of fact, he's perhaps the top voice in a conversation, right, around process mining. And there are certain problems and there are certain issues that they focus on. And he's doing a great job in that conversation. I would argue Brian has never been in a conversation. He's kind of talked to himself. He's grabbed people from even his earliest stuff. He was bringing it, it's like this strange kind of voice that was talking to himself and Martha Feldman. And then a few of us were listening to him, but we didn't know what and he always, and that's why he's a catalyst. He's pulling this process. He wants to make his argument better. He wants to get more disciples, more minions, because he sees something that the rest doesn't, right? I think Will, he's got his minions, right? He's got his conversation going. I think Brian's career has been trying to get a very important conversation going. And he's now, I think the 2016 org size special issue was really, in many ways, I would argue, as one of your fans, right, as kind of like, okay, this is your conversation that you started is now a real conversation. And there are people who are doing it without you, and they're going to continue this, right? So it happened. That's my assessment, Recker, of the situation. But we're running out of time. I want to do two things before we end, and you tell me. One is I want Will and Brian to give, because so many young researchers listen to our podcast. Yeah. I've been getting emails from them. I want advice to young researchers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the other thing I want to do is I want to be serenaded by Brian, because he's got a guitar, and I think he should sing to us. So those are the two things. Is that a good way to wrap things up, you think? All right, so let's start. Will, why don't you start, so that I can... and then Brian, you'll finish, and then wrap us up with some song, with a beautiful melody.
Yeah, so my advice to young researchers would be to completely ignore whatever journals or whatever publication strategy whatsoever.
That's nice.
I think at the end, the things that you would like to have is some form of impact. Right? You would like not to write a paper so that it can be published in a journal that is prestigious. You should want to write a paper because you really believe in the ideas, and you want other people to build upon these ideas. So that would be my advice. You typically can only do that if you do that. For me, it's easy to say, right? For a young researcher, it's much more difficult. But you have to realize that you can only do that, you can only get such a position if you are willing to do it for the long term. So Jan probably remembers when I started to talk about process mining, but it took and now everybody thinks it's great, right? But 10 years ago,
everyone thought it was a crazy idea.
It was very difficult.
Where the hell will you ever get that data from? That's what I was thinking.
So my advice would be, forget about where you publish, focus on what you want to do and what you think has impact.
Cool. Brian, what do you think?
I think that's great advice. No, I would say, it crystallizes kind of a slightly different way of saying the same thing, which is, try to find a story that I think in terms of stories, but try to find a problem that you feel you can continue working on, right? And and it's very important. I mean, this is kind of an MIT thing, actually. It's a funny thing. So we'll sometimes have phenomenon driven.
That's where you get your PhD.
Yeah, that's my background. And so we always used to think of ourselves as phenomenon driven. So I was interested in, I don't want to digress, but the advice is, find a phenomenon that seems important, that's going to have some kind of impact, have some kind of audience. And it's not about finding the particular journal, and this is really unorthodox thinking. I mean, what Will said is completely not how our graduate students think. Like, oh my God.
Exactly.
Like,
and I want to bring up, because I still want to stress that point, that is all fair and it's nice and it's also idealistic, because the reality that I see is that maybe the students come in, they have that aspiration, and I really think they do. And then they get their supervisors and they tell them, here's the list of 8 journals, and here's we need to get 7 out this year, and next year it'll be 4, because otherwise you won't get your PhD. And that, as far as I've seen it, that is completely transdisciplinary. We've seen that in IS, of course. I remember computer sciences faculty that I work with, and they said, oh, you need 4 points or 5 points. And there's a point merit scheme for getting your PhD. So I like the advice, but we also got to realize that's not only up to the student. It also speaks a lot to their advisors.
They want to get tenure.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's a broader structure that also needs to change to make that happen.
They want to get a job in the first place. They want to just even get a job at all.
Yeah.
Our students are saying, true. I need to have a paper in one of those Alist journals, or else I'm not even going to make the cut.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's and then the intersection of a meaningful thing and an Alist publication is just...
That's the key. I think Alist publications, it's easy, Brian, for you to say this because you've published more ASQs than I think I've published papers, right? And I think that there's this they're the prestigious journals, and they're tough to get into. And that's how you get tenure. Deans in the US count in business schools journals, right? So that advice is great for, I actually gave different advice in yesterday. I was talking to 2 junior people, and I said, if you learn, and this is just in what I know in information systems, if you learn a method, you can get published, right? If you're a really good experimentalist, good econometrician, that sort of thing. And there are people who know their method and get data sets and publish a ton. If you follow a phenomenon, you might get that first 1 or 2 papers on blockchain or whatever, and then you get a lot of citations, right? But the people who have the impact over time are the ones with an idea, right? And that idea is, and you really need to understand what's going on with the idea, where it's, and that's the hardest part. And sometimes even if an idea by itself, without the method, without the other parts, the phenomenon is nothing, right? So you have to put it all together, but without the idea, you don't get the international reputation. And I think both Will and Brian, you both championed an idea, an original way of looking at an issue, and then fought for it. And it has reached fruition, that I've seen since I've been an academic, right? So I would argue that's your key to success.
Yeah, but I would probably if I look in the computer science field, right, and perhaps we are in a luxurious position at this point in time, it is not a problem at all to find a job, right? Yeah. It is not difficult at all. Perhaps it's too easy.
Yeah.
Right? So I think in our field there is the possibility to just follow your ideas, be good at it, convince people that your ideas are important. I think that's very well possible. And if I look in let's say the broader BPM community, I see incredibly many young, talented people that do not care so much about this and are extremely successful.
They are extremely successful.
I would make it more positive than that. Okay. Like in the end, you want to do, if you stay in academia, if that is your goal, it's better to do something that you like. Otherwise, it will not be a pleasant experience.
Brian, you want to take it? Do you still do Dr. Decade stuff everywhere? Do you new YouTube?
Nah, I've been doing
Posts,
my
yeah.
day job. Yeah, my day
Okay.
job has been very consuming lately, but I've been learning to play drums during the pandemic. Does that
Oh,
count?
geez. Well, take us out, Brian. Thank you very much, both of you.
I'm just going to
Take us
sing
out
this
with
one
some
little
song.
phrase. Just one, no, just one little phrase out of one song. It's not hard to see things from a process point of view. Once you realize that every moment is brand new, all you've got to do is find the rhythm and the rhyme in the endless stream of moments as you're thrown through time. Bye, everybody.
All right,
Bye-bye.
bye, gentlemen. That was really great. Thank
Thank
you
you.
very
That's
much,
nice.
Will and Brian.